years, Vernon and his followers live in buses and tents without running water or electricity. It's rough living conditions for them. They were basically camping in East Texas. And Vernon took this time to experiment with his message and also redefine what a prophet for the Branch Davidians would be. One day during the mid-1980s, Vernon claims that God's message is made manifest to him.
Local communities and restore ecosystems. Let's use human development to empower people as stewards of the planet. Let's fight inequality and ensure everyone has an equal voice. Now is our chance to build a brighter future.
Humanity is at a crossroads. People are putting too much pressure on our planet, which puts us all at risk. A year ago, I joined the United Nations Development Program on a fact-finding mission to the Amazon rainforest in Peru. I saw the devastating environmental consequences of deforestation, and I also met with communities living in extreme poverty. People with no choice but to clear sections of the forest to plant food needed to feed their families. I witnessed how inequality and poverty are intertwined with the climate crisis. Only by tackling these challenges together can we fix our planet and our societies. Reforestation is just one of the nature-based solutions that can help communities flourish and lower carbon emissions. A future where both people and planet can thrive is possible. Let's make it a reality.
While humanity has achieved incredible things, it's clear that we have taken our planet for granted. Across the world, young people have spoken up. We see the damage done to our planet by governments, by businesses, by those who are in charge. And we know that these actions put our collective future at risk. We will not accept that this is the only way of doing things. It's time for humans to fix the mess we have created. As the 2020 Human Development Report makes clear, we need to transform our relationship with the planet, to make energy and material consumption sustainable, to ensure every young person is educated and empowered to fully appreciate the wonders that a healthy world can provide, so that all young people, especially in their diversity, have a say over their lives and their planet. We are the first generation that truly comprehends this challenge, and it is up to all of us to demand a better future.
The Human Development Report has never had a virtual global launch before, so how are we doing? Well, on the specialised platform, on this little web picture right here, there are over 1,700 of you. Even more on Facebook and more on Twitter, posting using hashtag HDR2020. And if you're on the dashboard, the specialised dashboard for the Human Development Report 2020, in the comments and the question section, you will find UNDP team members who were involved in the writing of this year's report, who will answer your questions, well, as many as they possibly can. The co-hosts for this year's report, UNDP and also Sweden. So, Prime Minister Löfven, good to have you back, and also Administrator Steiner, welcome back as well. I really love the way that you started off our launch. It was formal, it was appropriate. I'm going to ask you something just off the cuff, because I'm wondering what's going on in your brain right now. So no filter, okay? No filter. The first thing you think of, Prime Minister is quaking, but no need. I say to you, Prime Minister Löfven, 2020, what's your immediate reaction back to me?
It was quite here to heart. There was some noise, I couldn't really hear it properly, sorry.
Not a problem. If I say the year 2020, your immediate reaction back. 2020. Immediate candid reaction. Pandemic.
It's a really, it's a hard year for the whole world's population. So we have to really combat this pandemic, and in doing so, make sure also that we that we advocate for equality in doing so.
Okay, very good. Administrator Steiner, I say green growth to you. Your immediate, unfiltered reaction back is what?
The future, right before us, already around us, and I think inevitable coming out of this pandemic, the way that we need to think about our economies, our societies in the future.
And one more, Human Development Report, Prime Minister.
One more. Thank you. Yeah.
The Human Development Report, instant reaction back, no filter. First thoughts come to mind.
First thing is about hope, and that we actually combine the necessity of developing our societies with the climate perspective. So I think we're reaching a momentum now where more and more people see both the necessity of combating climate change, but also the positive perspective of that. It's not a burden. It's not something that we have to do, something that we want to do, because we can now clearly see here is the new technology, here is the future welfare. So I think, I really think it's a positive thing that the climate issue is so clearly underlined in this report.
Administrator Steiner, it was almost just moments into the COVID crisis where I started to hear the phrase coming from the development world of build back better. You finesse that a little bit more, build back greener, more equitably, sustainably. What does that actually mean now that we are in December?
I think what this notion of not going back to where we were is, first of all, in December, a realization that that world that we lived in before COVID hit us already was full of challenges. And whether we look to climate change, to inequality, I just remember the last 24, 36 months, the evening news, the newspapers, we had demonstrations, we had people across the world, young people losing confidence and patience, people who are poor losing confidence in governments. When politics, steps out into the streets, this is always a sign that, whether you call it a social contract, you call it governance, there are many ways to describe it. We are losing a consensus and we lose confidence in the future. From there, polarization comes. People buy out, they don't buy in. They get angry. When you're hungry, it is easy to get angry because you see at the same time extraordinary wealth on the other side of a fence or of a street. So I think in December 2020, first of all, we are scared because we've lost control. And the simple fact is 2020 was a year where we lost control over lives and the way we thought we can run the world. And we are scared because we're not quite sure whether we can really build forward better from here. And I think that's why to Prime Minister Löfven's, and by the way, good afternoon, Prime Minister, we have been sitting in separate virtual rooms, but it's fantastic to be here with you. I think it is precisely this moment in which leadership suddenly becomes such a vital currency in our societies and not the financial currency. Because it is leadership that we need to not drift back to where we were before. And we have to make bold choices. The decision to have this experimental planetary adjusted human development index was also a risk because it is an experimental one and we could be criticized for not having presented a perfect index. But it was the right thing to do, I think, this year because people want to discuss precisely the uncertainties and the choices around here. And I think that's where leadership is something that is not just limited to prime ministers and presidents, to CEOs. It's actually within each one of us to find that strength of conviction to lead forward. And that's, to me, December 2020. Scared, but not giving up.
Prime Minister, do you sense that fear in Sweden, particularly about employment, the economy, and the way ahead? Because your commitment to employment, your commitment to sustainability, has that wavered in any way this year?
Well, I would say that in the beginning, when we started to really push for this to combat climate change, yes, there was a bit of resistance, fear. What does it really mean for the economy, for my job? But as I said, I'm sure now we're reaching a momentum where more and more people see that it is possible, due to the fact that we as a country decided upon this goal of becoming climate neutral by 2045, and being very persistent in that goal, making sure that we have a framework, a climate framework in handling this, putting up goals for different sectors of the economy, making sure that we cooperate with different sectors of the economy, creating roadmaps. Now we can see, the steel industry, and listen to this, steel has been produced in the same way, basically, for 1,000 years. Now we are developing a new way of producing steel without using coal. That's a revolution. Now we have our biggest mining company changing its whole production structure to become climate neutral. And in doing so, they're not only producing their own products climate neutral, but also giving their customers a chance to produce climate neutral products. So this is now changing totally, and we're making sure that cars need to be clean in the future, step by step by step. So now we can see, it doesn't mean that we're losing our job. It means new jobs, yes. So we have to make sure that we can cope with this transition. And another key word is to make sure that everybody is on board on this future project, meaning that we have to also be sure that people can get training for new jobs. But more and more people see now this is possible. We can both combat climate change and create new jobs, and thereby also making sure that we can tell our kids you will have clean air in the future, you can live a good life, but also making sure that you have jobs in the future and developing your own life. So I think this is crucial.
I can see why you're both in the same conversation together, Prime Minister and Administrator, because Administrator, I've heard you so many times say it doesn't have to be people or the planet, that both are possible, and that seems to be what's underlying this year's Human Development Report. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, often when I speak to young people in schools, it's so obvious, it's so self-evident that young people actually intuitively get it far quicker than when we grow up to be adults and rationalize all sorts of trade-offs. And how on earth will we live on the planet with soon 9-10 billion people and continue to pollute the atmosphere? We are changing the climate. We are destroying the biosphere. There is an obvious logic to saying it cannot be people or planet, and yet we have been entrapped. And 13 years ago, when Mahbub ul-Haq and Amartya Sen had this bold vision of challenging this notion that human progress is essentially a matter of measuring it by economic metrics of gross domestic product, they were criticized, they were challenged. Many rejected the initial Human Development Index as distorting and naive. And yet, here we are, 30 years later. Look at how our societies are in part falling apart over inequality, and therefore the choices that we need to make are actually not God-given or in the realm of the laws of physics. We can choose to have cleaner energy. The patents for renewable energy technology have been in drawers since the beginning of the 20th century. Why did it take us 100 years to act on them? Because we didn't believe we had to make a choice, and we just thought we would go on. So, to me, what the Prime Minister also said just now, we now live in an age, this age of the Anthropocene, that is, in one sense, yes, a harsh reminder that we have crossed a certain threshold and that we are in very dangerous territory. But we're also the richest, most educated generation with the greatest new technological frontiers also available to us. We can define whole new choices that we make. And that, I think, is where the moment takes us right now. People or planet is the conversation of the 19th and 20th century. I think the 21st century is about getting to that box in the graph that the Human Development Report has so clearly identified, which is the future. And if we don't get there, the future gets bleaker and bleaker. And I think climate change in some ways relates so well to the pandemic also, because what COVID-19 showed us just in a matter of 3 months is what climate change will do to us for 300 or even 1,000 years. We cannot simply put the foot on the brake, get out of a problem and move into another planet. Climate change locks us in for literally hundreds of generations. And that time window is a constant reminder of how in COVID-19, we knew that this could happen. We even prepared for it to some extent, and yet we could not control it. And look how much suffering this has caused in just 11 months. That's why I think this year's Human Development Report is such a bold way of saying, stop giving us false choices and trade-offs. Let us shape the kind of society and economy we want. And out of that does not come an environmentalist nirvana or a social activist nirvana. It is the consensus we build about how much inequality do we really want to tolerate in our societies, how much destruction of the environment are we prepared to justify in order to do X for 5 cents less than before. These are the false choices we have been locked into for so long, and I think it is high time that we listen to our young people. They have understood this far more clearly, they are far more prepared to act on it, and I think those of us who have a possibility to, whether it is a prime minister in my capacity, your capacity, Femi, as a broadcaster, as somebody who speaks to millions of people, let's stop living in denial, let's act with responsibility. And I think that is a new way of thinking about what comes next.
Prime Minister, that is a direct challenge, not just to you and to Sweden, but to all of us. How are you going to take on that challenge heading into the new year and beyond?
As I said, being very persistent on the goal that basically it's very simple. We must give that promise to the children and our grandchildren. I can say every time I meet our family's grandchildren, I think about this. What are their future? It is my task. All of us need to be very persistent in making sure that they can live a good life in the future when it comes to climate. But the good thing is also that talk about all the things that will be better, not only the climate, but also jobs and all these things, the welfare, the equality, combating inequality, that we can do so much more in making sure that people are getting on board on the future project. Because today we're not only letting people starve, which is bad enough, but we're not taking the resources, we're not using all the resources that we have. The humanity has still so much to do. And therefore look at this positive side, that we have a double positive side. The climate is one, but better lives for all humanity. And that takes a national decision making, a local, but also a global, a multilateral. And I'm looking forward to continuing cooperating with all colleagues all over the world to make sure we do this together. And I think perhaps that is the strongest signal we can send, is doing it together. We will make it. There's no doubt about that.
Gentlemen, Prime Minister, Administrator, may I congratulate you on having a free-flowing conversation in two very different parts of the world. You've absolutely nailed the virtual part of our global launch. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
I mean, may I add one last small remark? Because
of course, you're the administrator of the UNDP. I'm not allowed to say no to you.
No, I just want to say, because one of the interesting things in this year's Human Development Report is actually that Sweden, contrary to many other high-developed, wealthier countries, didn't change its ranking as much. And in that sense, I want to recognize also that the deliberate over a number of years and governments direction that Swedish society chose to drive its own development is already putting it in a class of very few countries that are a step ahead of where many others are. And this is not I think, only a matter of being richer or wealthier. It comes down to the choices that Swedish people made and that are paying off today. And I think we have a lot to learn. And that's why I was so pleased, Prime Minister, when you invited us today to come and launch this report with you from Sweden, but at the same time speak to all the realities across the globe. And I think Prime Minister Motley reminded us also, you know, when you're a small island developing state, you have far less freedom to choose. You depend so much more on other people's choices. And that's one reason why I believe so much in the United Nations. And I thank Sweden also for its commitment, because it is sometimes for the countries that don't rate on the top of a radar or a league table that I think the United Nations is a vital part of keeping our eyes on what matters. Thank you.
If you go to the Human Development Report, Prime Minister, go ahead, please.
No, I just said, Administrator Steiner, I agree a lot, and as I said in my opening remarks, we do support the multilateral cooperation. It's crucial, not least in these days. So I would like to thank the administrator also for your efforts, and we'll see you in the future cooperation.
Gentlemen, dare I wrap up this segment? Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Administrator. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. If you go onto the Human Development website, you will find the Human Development Index, and Sweden is number 8 on that index. It is a fascinating way to see your region, your part of the world, and how it rates. We move on with some reflections about what we've heard so far on this global virtual launch of the Human Development Report 2020. Our reflections begin with Minister Olsen. Minister Per Olsen Frid is the State Secretary to the Minister for International Development and Cooperation in Sweden. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, and Excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, what a day so far, what a launch so far. And as a long-time advocate for transformative climate action, we welcome that UNDP has adjusted the Human Development Report and Index. For the first time, it takes pressure on the pressure we put on the planet, and it takes that into account in this index. And the planet-adjusted Human Development Index fills an important gap by showcasing new and, in some respect, more honest ways of measuring human development. And the new report gives us food for thought and tools for action and improvement. Our planet is in the state of climate emergency. Our relationship with other species is in crisis, with an alarming acceleration of species extinction because of our activities on land and below water. And right now the world is challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only do we need to build back better, but more importantly, build back greener. The recovery must be aligned with the ambitions and goals laid out in the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We desperately need a world more sustainable, more equal, more gender equal. It is in our common interest. And allow me to be frank. I mean, we, the industrialized countries with the means to transition, we must lead the way. Rich countries that are causing the most damage must shoulder their share of responsibility. Sweden, too, has a long way to go. Our material footprint is too large to be sustainable. The same is true of our carbon emissions. However, we're taking forceful actions against towards a more sustainable future. The Swedish government has introduced the highest carbon tax in the world and a robust climate act, and is committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2045. We wholeheartedly welcome all competition to beat us to that post. As for Sweden's international development cooperation, we will work continuously to build partnerships with developing countries to support their endeavors to choose a path that is friendly to planet and to people. By increasing our financial for international climate action and biodiversity, we will not only contribute to building resilience for the people most exposed and most vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation, we will also strive to ensure that tangible results reach those furthest left behind. Now is the time to take more concrete action, to robust invest in green technology to put an end to fossil fuel subsidies, phase out oil production, stop the construction of new coal power plants, and instead integrate the goal of carbon neutrality into all economic and fiscal policies and decisions. Change is made possible when introducing a do-no-harm measures and incentives for doing long-term good into our economies. By using nature-based solutions and respecting human rights, gender equality and democratic values, and by using indigenous people's knowledge, things can change. Things will change. And the Human Development Report enhances this momentum. We have no time to lose. We need to fundamentally change our relationship with nature. And this is also the aim of the high-level UN meeting that Sweden has offered to host in Stockholm in June 2022. 50 years since the world gathered in Stockholm in 1972 for the first UN conference on the human environment. This conference can play an important role in promoting a more systematic approach to many of the environmental and climate-related challenges the world is facing today. Change for the better through cooperation is possible. With people and planet at the center, a future to long for, a future to fight for. Thank you.
Many thanks. The Executive Director of United Nations Environment Programme is Inga Anderson. She has been following the global launch of the Human Development Report 2020. I know she's already seen the Human Development Report as well. Executive Director, your reflections, your thoughts?
Well, this has been an extraordinarily interesting evening for me, since I'm not in the US. A very, very interesting discussion. And I think that this new angle of the Human Development Report is more timely than ever. We need that planet-adjusted Human Development Index to fully begin to understand our relationship with nature, as we've also heard from the previous speakers. And if we just look around, the hurricanes in the Atlantic, we've had to even use the Greek alphabet to count them. That's how many we have. Fires, inundations, heat waves, etc. Trillions spent on this recovery to reboot an antiquated and out of the future, not ready for the future economic system. So the Secretary General of the United Nations said it very well, just in his State of the Planet speech. Making peace with nature, he said, is the defining task of the 21st century. It must be, he said, the top priority for everyone, everywhere. And so this new way of looking at human development, adjusting for that making peace with nature becomes critical. We at UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, which I have the privilege to head, and which of course was the result of the Stockholm Conference in 1972, to which State Secretary Fred referred. We see three planetary crises that we need to tackle: the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. And just last week, we launched the Emissions Gap Report, where we're showing that we're heading towards a 3-degree world at the end of 2100 if we don't take action. So understanding new measurements and integrating this, such as this new Human Development Index, becomes critical. Same for pollution. We are emitting about 400 million tons of heavy metals, sludge, solvents, other wastes into the environment. Surely that has a value detracting from the future equity and sustainability, and surely that's the thing we need to take account of. And as we just heard from the speakers before me, biodiversity, nature, as we heard from Akim, is what feeds us and clothes us and gives us the air we breathe and the water we drink. And yet we are on track to lose and cause extinction to 1 million out of the 7.8 million species that exist. So really and truly, these three planetary crises, we need to understand that not only are they very real, and therefore we need to change the way in which we measure how we deal with development, but they are also profoundly unfair. The world's wealthiest 1%, showed our Emissions Gap Report, account for more than twice of the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. That's something to reflect on. And so at the root of all of this, we have the unsustainable consumption and production. And we heard Prime Minister Louine speak to this issue. We need to change. We can't continue with the footprint that the wealthy countries have. We need to ensure that we live within sustainable range. And this new Human Development Index that accounts for the planet will help get us there. So we at UNEP, we're very, very proud to have partnered with UNDP in developing this. And we very much salute our friends and Atkins leadership and all the friends at the Human Development Office for this work. Because bringing to the Human Development Index these new metrics matters. We have contributed on the natural capital side, on the inclusive wealth side, and we can see that only by looking at it in this way can we begin to address these three planetary crises that I spoke of: climate crisis, nature crisis, and the pollution crisis. Our planet needs a whole of society approach. We need to think about entire landscapes, entire seascapes, and that support livelihoods, businesses, supply chain, economies, and the next generation. And it is, as we just heard from State Secretary Fred, in everyone's interest, but it is also everyone's responsibility. So with the Human Development Report, we salute it. We're very pleased with this new way of thinking about it. I was in UNDP back 30 years ago when Maqbool introduced, together with Amartya Sen, the new Human Development Index. It was revolutionary at the time. What we're seeing today is the second wave in that journey of thinking differently about development, and it is the right way to go. Thank you.
Executive Director of UNEP, Inga Anderson, thank you so much. Appreciate you. So that is the first part of our virtual global launch of the Human Development Report. We wrap up the first part with UNDP, Goodwill Ambassadors, and a never-before-seen video. This is the premiere. Take a look.
Throughout time, the planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
But now, in the era of the human, we are shaping the planet.
And truthfully, we are not doing a good job at it yet. Our actions are putting a lot of pressure on the world. Just look at 2020 with COVID-19, extreme weather, and rampant wildfires. People have created this mess, but we can fix it.
Empowered people can become agents of their own destiny. The world may seem stuck in its own ways, but we can take actions to create a new normal, whether that's expanding the role of women in society or using cleaner energy.
In too many countries, fossil fuels remain the primary source of energy, but clean alternatives like solar power will help reduce our carbon emissions. These alternatives need to be made accessible and affordable without using too much of other finite resources.
And we must learn to harness the power of nature at the same time as we protect its beauty and wonder. Moving to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems in a way that promotes well-being.
Too often, the decisions of a few people or countries hurt the most vulnerable people across the world. For all of us to flourish now and into the future, we must understand that we are all connected. The choices you make impact the whole world around you.
Shaping the planet means
taking bold steps.
Bold steps for humans to survive and thrive in this new era.
If we are going to change the world,
we need you.
We need you.
We need you, our global leaders, to take bold action now.
You are now part of the Leaders' Dialogue. Welcome to your dialogue. In this conversation, you will meet politicians, policymakers, academics, and also the private sector, plus you, of course. So this is the time to use your Q&A box and share your questions, your thoughts about the Human Development Report. We're going a little bit deeper, in fact, a lot deeper, and looking at mechanisms for change. I'm being very specific here. We're looking at incentives, how regulations may well impact change the different kind of change that we're looking for, that you've heard our first group of speakers all talking about and advocating for. I want you to meet your panel, meet the people in the dialogue, and then we'll have a deeper conversation with them. So, Senior Minister Tharman from Singapore, I would like you to introduce yourself to our global audience and tell them very briefly your connection with Human Development Report. It's a good one.
Well, thanks, Femi. My name is Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I'm a Senior Minister in Singapore. I had the privilege of co-chairing the Advisory Council for the Human Development Report this year with Professor Michael Spence. And it's been a real privilege and a real learning journey for all of us.
Great to have you. More from you in just a moment. Minister Andrea Meza Moila, nice to see you. Please introduce yourself and the connection with the Human Development Report for this year that you have. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. Good night. I'm Andrea Meza. I'm the Minister of Energy and Environment from Costa Rica, and we are delighted of being here and learning from these new approaches on how to measure development and what development means. So we are very excited to share a little bit about the experience of Costa Rica in nature-based elements.
We're looking forward to that. Roberto Marquez is also joining us, really representing the private sector. Not all of it, but for him, for his specific point of view. Would you introduce yourself, tell our global audience what is important about what you represent and the connection with the Human Development Report for this year?
Of course, Femi, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. It's great to be here on this very important day. Very inspiring so far, the sessions. And for us, Natura & Co., which is a company that is present over 100 countries, touching, over 200 million customers. The idea of a human development, the idea of how we can really balance and drive business growth in a more sustainable, equitable, and just way. It is just something that is really core to everything we do, and we continue to learn and be inspired by, what we heard so far today. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, the previous speakers have set the bar high, but I believe in you. I know you're going to be able to do this beautifully. Professor Reyes, so good to see you. Will you introduce yourself to our audience? Everybody has so many amazing titles. I wanted them to introduce themselves to you in a way that framed why they were in this particular launch, and also, of course, your connection to the Human Development Report 2020. Hello, Professor Reyes.
Thanks so much, Femi, and it's a real honor to be here. So my name is Belinda Reyes, and I hold the Research Chair in Sustainability Science at the newly established Future Africa Institute at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. But I also am a senior advisor at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University in Sweden, which is actually how I became connected to this Human Development Report, as both a contributor to much of the background information on the science of the Anthropocene, and especially the science around people-planet relationships in the Anthropocene. And then I was also very privileged to be one of the reviewers of the final report, which was a great task and a really pleasant undertaking. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome, everybody. All right, this is your dialogue, so whenever you need to speak, you just go ahead. I am your mere facilitator. Tharman, let's start with you. Takeaway. This is hardcore. Takeaway for policymakers out of this Human Development Report. The takeaway regarding the incentives. What do you think will make change happen?
So, first of all, I think we have to dispel the idea that we have to choose between growth and non-growth, or even degrowth. And I say this because there is still debate on this. There's still a significant body of opinion that says we should stop growing, or at the very least, upper middle income countries and rich countries should stop growing. What the report shows is that we don't have to choose between growth and non-growth, between development and non-development. band between human development and planetary sustainability. There is a large arena of viable choices that allow us to pursue growth and development and ensure a sustainable planet and ensure that we preserve the biodiversity that is in fact the life support system for human development. And the report does it not just by incantation or by nice-sounding political statements, but by showing that there are those viable choices. And it requires incentives, it requires regulation, it requires investment, including a role for public investment and public-private partnerships. It requires changes in social norms that are ultimately underpinned by a new set of values. One thing that we have to recognize is that we're not going to get onto this path of sustainable growth, inclusive and sustainable growth, if we simply rely on the markets, because it's the markets that have brought us here to begin with. If we leave it to the markets, we'll continue for a while yet on an unsustainable path. And not because markets are motivated by bad people, it's just in the nature of competitive markets that we'll continue along an unsustainable path until we have our backs against the wall. And it'll then be too late. It'll be too late to reverse unsustainability and the loss and the tilt in the world's, the globe, the planet's biological balance. It'll be too late. So we have to act now, and we have to act using public policy, using new public-private partnerships, and using collective action, the agency of people to shape new norms. And it can be done, and that's, in my view, the richest part of this report is about how it's actually being done around the world, in both advanced countries and developing countries. Specific examples, not necessarily nationwide projects, but community action or private corporations who are now in fact embarking on whole new growth strategies. It can be done, and we have to scale up those examples. Incentives matter. You have to put a price on carbon. We have to move away from fossil fuel subsidies, which, by the way, are big. They are big around the world. There's a whole range of countries where fossil fuel subsidies amount to something like 2 to 3% of GDP, or half the education budgets of many countries. It'll need not just pricing, it'll need regulation. Because pricing alone is going to take a while before it changes economic choices and consumption choices. It's going to need investment. And remember this, the better we invest in new technologies that can reduce the costs of clean and green energies and make zero carbon energy a possibility at some point in the future at acceptable costs, the better we do that, the less we'll have to raise carbon taxes in the future. Carbon taxes will have to go up, but they'll go up by much less if we succeed in investing in new technologies that drive down the costs of the alternatives to fossil fuels. And finally, agency is important. Social norms are important, coming out of not just bold political choices, but coming out of the small d in democracies, not just the big D, but the small d. Groups, individuals, NGOs, civil society, communities, having the agency to start their own initiatives, spread awareness about the issues, and to start shaping new social norms. And of course, finally, multilateral action. This is about a global externality, as the economists would put it, and you need global public goods, but you also need every nation to play its part. And we need to exercise peer pressure on each other, hold ourselves up to our own commitments, and nudge those commitments forward over time. We should take advantage of COVID in one respect. COVID's been a tragedy around the world, but the silver lining is that it's led to a new zeitgeist. People recognize there's such a thing as the public good. People recognize that everyone has to play their part. People recognize there's a role for governments, for public action, and new public-private partnerships. And we've got to take advantage of the zeitgeist to invest big in sustainability, to have a bold role for public policy in incentives and regulation, and to shape new norms. I'll stop there.
As you were speaking, Andrea was nodding, and if I remember correctly, it was the point where Tharman was saying you don't have to sacrifice growth. That seemed to resonate with you. Can you pick up from that point? What was the point of agreement? And then take us on and give us those real down on the ground examples that you said you wanted to share with us from Costa Rica.
Thank you. And absolutely, this really resounds on the elements that I would like to share. One is that the country has progressed 37 position in the Human Development Index. And I will say that this is a demonstration that nature-based human development is possible. And I absolutely see that this shows that policy matters. It was 20 years ago that we decided to prohibit land use change, but at the same time, we generated an incentive, a new mechanism, and it was the Payment for Environmental Services scheme. So it was regulation and an incentive. And these two elements need to be there, and clear policies. Absolutely. These elements are central. And if we decided then to create a tax on fossil fuels 20 years ago to generate this fund, and at the same time to mobilize resources to the owners of the forest. And again, we need to also give some value to nature, and at the same time, people there in the rural territories are recognizing that this generates a benefit for them. Most of the funds that we have been collecting from this tax on fossil fuels, we are directing these funds to rural communities. More than $500 million for a middle-income country. I know that sometimes it doesn't sound too much, but it is money. It is our own resources, a policy decision that we are mobilizing to improve and to help more than 15,000 families in the rural territories, and a lot of them indigenous communities. And again, what we are seeing is that we need to make and have a clear analysis of where we want to go. And right now we launch our long-term strategy, which is our decarbonization plan. And we are also committed to be carbon neutral in 2050. And again, this is not an environmental issue. This is a development model. Again, we are making choices on what is the kind of development that we want to bring. And we are defining pathways for the new urban areas, for the rural territories, for the kind of innovation that we want. We need to have policy coherence. And of course, this will demand, again, some transformational elements also in green fiscal reforms. And it's the kind of analysis that we are doing, is the kind of arguments. If we want to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and I totally agree, and we still have some elements that we need to improve in that area, we also need to see the distributional impacts of those kind of measures. And again, do the balance to implement some coherence in this kind of policies. So we really want to welcome the report. We think it's a very good contribution when we have new measures on what development means. And it's the kind of arguments that we need also at the local level, because we are facing some difficult times, as all the countries with the COVID crisis, a small fiscal space. And we are also hearing some voices that would like to take another pathway. So when we are hearing that we want to have well-being, and that it is possible also with nature-based solutions, is the kind of elements that we need to continue to implement and to improve. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Roberto, the phrase that I'm hearing a lot this year, because COVID-19 has given us all this reset, everything's shut down before it springs back up again. And the idea of let's get back to normal. And then there's this push about let's not get back to normal. Let's do things differently. So if you're looking at potentially incentives or maybe regulations that will work from the private sector's point of view, what would you tell us? What would you advise us? What works for you and your organization, your company, your business?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So listen, I think as we are hearing, and I completely agree, I think the private sector has a very important role. And the first one is to understand and embrace that it's not growth at any cost, right? We need to think about sustainable growth. And it is possible, it is absolutely possible to combine economic development in a sustainable way, right? And I think we also need to be clear about the choices that we make and how we hold ourselves accountable, which goes back to your point of incentives and how we really raise the bar. So I'll give you the example of Natura & Co. Earlier this year, in the middle of this pandemic, we actually issued our 2030 commitment to life, our sustainability plans. We set a very ambitious target. We want to become net zero emission by 2030, 20 years ahead of the commitment with the United Nations. We want to make sure that we pay living wage or above to all of our associates, 40,000 of them. In Brazil, we've already been inspired by the human development and tracking the human development progress with our consultants. Globally now we have over 6 million of them. Just in the last 2 years, by really tracking and focusing on that, we've seen double-digit improvement in health and financial knowledge within the network of our consultants and representatives. We are very committed also to drive circularity of our packaging, biodegradable, renewable ingredients in our formulation. By setting those targets high, Femi, I also think that you end up driving innovation. And again, it's not either or. By really embracing those things, you really drive a very innovative mindset in the organization. People want to do this. And if you, again, set the right direction, you make the right choices, and you hold yourselves accountable. So part of the incentives, that's very important, part of the incentives of our executives is linked to delivering against sustainability goals. It's not just delivering the profit, or it's not just delivering, the financial results, but it's about the planet, it's about people, right? So if you combine those things, it's absolutely doable. Natura has been working the Amazon for 20 years and has demonstrated that it is possible to actually drive economic progress for those communities and keeping the forest standing, right? It does require effort, it does require leadership, it does require choices, and also this notion that it's not growth at any cost. The good news, Penny, is that I see more and more the investor community, the market, paying more attention to ESGs, paying more attention to companies and making those choices, the incentives that we're referring to companies that actually are embracing that. But we need more. We need many more companies, private sector, multilateral approach to make sure that this becomes a reality. So the private sector needs to play its role, and its role of really embracing sustainable growth and embracing that it's more than just the bottom line, but it's really combining planet, people, and profit.
What I'm hearing so far from our Leaders Dialogue is hope and change. That is possible, to borrow a phrase from somewhere else and someplace else. Belinda, jump in here, although I feel that people have stolen your thunder, because there is total agreement here with the idea that people do not have to be versing the planet. It doesn't have to be either or. Expand on that more, please.
Yeah, exactly, Femi. I think as many of the previous speakers and now as the ministers have just highlighted, these things like climate change and species extinctions and deforestation and pollution that we used to label environmental impacts or environmental risks, they're now actually development risks. And especially in the context of the Anthropocene, this hyper-connected and rapidly changing world that we now live in, an environmental impact in one part of the world can ripple and connect across scales and land with social and economic consequences in a far distant place, like a drought in Central Asia causing a food price spike in South Africa. And I think this really brings to the fore the point that many speakers are making, that we can't choose a policy or an action that's good for development and bad for environment. If it's bad for environment, it will be bad for development at some other time, in some other place, or for some other group. And what this report really helps to make clear is that it's not really about choosing between environment and development. At this moment, we're making choices that are bad for both. And we now really need to move ahead with a very clear-headed approach to policies and actions and practices that are good for people and the planet. And I think that, as both of the ministers had made clear, what this approach really helps us to do, this approach of people and planet, is to move behind this very blinkered or binary view we have of environment as protected areas which keep people out, and development as industrial economic growth and job creations of mines and factories, to actually find this very fertile middle ground of actions and projects and policies that build justice and peace and sustainability and regenerative practices and the necessary resilience capacities we're all going to need to navigate this turbulence that lies ahead. I'll leave it there for now and be happy to come back with some more details.
Thank you so much. Leaders, I'm opening up this conversation because our global virtual Human Development Report audience would like to speak to you directly. So this is Christopher Howes. What are the innovative approaches proposed that aim to tackle the impact of humans on the planet? Don't have to name all of them. Christopher, we don't want to do a spoiler for you. I do want you to read the Human Development Report. But some of the innovative approaches, what stood out for you? Tharman, go ahead.
Well, in fact, the impressive thing is in just the last 5 years, you've seen a whole set of new initiatives. We're listening to what Natura is doing. We're listening to examples across the world, including in relatively poor countries, by the way. You can take examples of countries which are disadvantaged in terms of size and natural resources. I mean, Singapore is an extreme example. Very small, virtually zero natural resources, no renewable energy potential within the country. But what we're doing, as an example, is to invest in floating solar photovoltaic systems, floating on the few reservoirs we have within the island and floating offshore. And in fact, we're now investing in what will be one of the world's largest such floating solar farms. It's an example of how necessity forces innovation. And there are lots of other choices. Some are very practical devices. In India, for instance, they're building large solar parks, so to speak, so that companies can come in and plug and play with less upfront construction costs, a lot of the logistics catered for. But you know, when you plan industrial parks such that each player who comes in finds it much easier to be able to move, to gear up on a renewable basis. I gave the example of solar parks, but there are many other examples. By taking care of the public goods dimension of an industrial park, you also make it easier for market players. So lots of innovations, and my sense is that this combination of incentives and disincentives, which come from pricing carbon and withdrawing fossil fuel subsidies. And as was pointed out, you've got to make sure as you withdraw subsidies that it's not unfair to the poor. You'll have to find some other ways of compensating, right? But it's not just about pricing and subsidies. It's about investment. It's about investment because the market on its own will find very often that the upfront costs of investment in these new technologies is too high, and you don't yet have scale of market demand. So the public sector is important, and public-private collaboration has turned out to be the basis on which solar energy has become so cheap. much cheaper than coal. Is the basis on which even wind and other renewable energies are becoming much cheaper. It is public-private collaboration. And likewise, when you look at CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage, what Norway has done, what some other countries have done, is about public-private collaboration to be able to deal with the upfront costs and get scale into the business.
Let me just get some more innovation as we push on with some more questions. We have 1,700 people on the platform, and I want to get to a few more of their questions. Is that possible? Roberto, innovation for you. What have you seen? What would you share with Chris to say, it is possible for us to actually live with the planet, and this is one idea. What would you like to share?
Well, I would probably, and I mentioned, share, the work that Natura has been doing for 20 years in the Amazon, really working with the local communities on biodiversity and really seeing what's possible to really, get the science, get the technology, get, solutions that potentially will create better products for the consumers, while at the same time keeping the forest standing and helping the communities to actually develop themselves. And we do that respecting the Nagoya Protocol, with not just pay for the communities on the ingredients that we are sourcing from them, but paying for their knowledge, which is almost like intellectual property, because those communities really detain those kind of information and intelligence. So it's very important to have those partnerships, and we heard also from the minister that, on the report, and we were very clear that just GDP growth is not going to reduce inequality. So, all of us need to work together in how to better distribute income, how to work with local communities. And the example of the Amazon, it's a win-win. You're helping the communities, you're helping preserving the forest, and you're making the companies more successful. So it's not a trade-off. And I think there are plenty of other examples that we get inspired by. And I think hopefully this will become, to your point, the new norm, moving forward.
Belinda, let me put this one to you. This question comes from Anne Ackerland from SIDA. And Anne says, as we move forward to implement needed changes for sustainable human progress within planetary boundaries, how can we make sure that we do not exacerbate existing grievances and inequalities, but rather seize on opportunities to enhance cooperation and social cohesion? How do we make sure to integrate conflict sensitivity in our efforts and the work that we do? The reason I want to throw that one to you is because I know that you are in the Global South, you think about the Global South, and you think about these issues from that perspective as well. Go ahead.
Well, that is an enormous question, a very important question, and one that could probably take me all day to answer. But I think perhaps two things spring to mind with that. The first is the Human Development Report actually talks about this three-pronged approach: innovation, equity, and stewardship of the planet. And what this suggests to me is we don't get too focused on just innovation, but we keep balancing it with thinking about, is it good for equality and is it good for the planet? Because innovation is no stranger to development. We've relied on lots of technology and lots of innovation and incentives in the past. So I feel like this more multidimensional approach to innovation is perhaps one that is important, because I think we have to acknowledge that we're not playing on a level playing field. And any innovation or any intervention has the potential to make that more level or less level. And I think that that's really key. If I look at the renewable energies example here in South Africa, that has enormous potential to enhance energy democracy and energy equality, as well as reduce carbon emissions. But unless we're very careful about how that is implemented, there are real consequences for job losses in the mining sector, for massive changes in the decentralization of electricity as well, that could actually have many unintended consequences. So I think that perhaps this is one thing that the report makes clear to me, and perhaps just a second point, that a lot of the time when we focus on the role of environment in development, we tend to often think about it as a material resource. And I think that there's a stronger voice coming now from the Global South, really highlighting that the environment isn't just a set of materials like water and food, but actually shapes identities and cultures and our relationships and our well-being in deep and important ways. And so I think it's also important that we think about innovation and social ecological innovation that's sensitive to these non-material links that communities have with their environment as well.
Andrea, you are making notes on your notepad. Share your notepad with us.
Yes, it's so inspiring listening to all these elements. It is critical whole of a government and whole of society approach. I will say that this is one of the key elements that we're hearing. And this interaction with the private sector is central. We, in the policy making area, we need to define clear policies, long-term policies, because this is a transformational element that will take time, and it is critical to have long-term plans. And at the same time, all these elements of innovation, how can we bring more the private sector? What are the kind of signals that we are giving? It's a central element. And of course, carbon pricing is critical. Carbon pricing must be there. The fossil fuel subsidies, we need to eliminate them. But it's also about investments. And I will say that we have been working in the enhancement of our NDC with the support of UNDP, by the way. And what we also are doing right now is generating our green recovery plan. And it is identifying the kind of investments that at the same time will allow us to generate green and blue jobs, and that it is possible, again, that we can identify good investments that will generate green and blue jobs. And also, we are having some analysis on how to green the financial system. And I would say that this is also another innovation out there, and we need to continue with that kind of work. We established some dialogues here with our bank system, with the regulators, but there are international aspects like the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, and I think that these aspects are also contributing to this transformational change. Our central bank, for example, has just become member of the network of greening the financial sector. And I would say that if we manage to put all these building blocks, good policies, incentives, regulations, and bring in the financial sector, then we will be able to do this transformation. And I think we are there. We are hearing here good examples. I totally agree that the private sector is there. It's looking for good opportunities for doing these investments, and we need to mobilize public and private resources aligned with this vision.
Roberta, I want to give this question to you. This one comes from Andy Davis. Do we need to redefine our ideas of growth to move away from market-driven concept of growth for its own sake? I am wondering how the private sector would even think about that. What is the point if you don't grow?
Well, and I agree. I mean, as I said earlier, I think the era of growth at any cost is gone. I think, consumers, customers, people in general are demanding companies to be more responsible, and the market should follow that, right? And that's why I'm optimistic, because I see more and more investors paying more attention to companies that really follow ESG principles. We balance, again, planet, profit, and people, right? At the end of the day, companies are not going to run a business in a dead planet, period, right? And we're not going to run a business if we continue to drive huge inequality, because there are going to be fewer and fewer households to consume our products. So you needed to address the climate crisis, we need to address inequality, and that needs to be front and center as part of the strategy for any organization moving forward. the good news is, I think, it's coming because